Introducing our guest this evening will be a member of our Board of Trustees and the Chairman of the Board of the Baltimore Gas and Electric Company, Mr. George McGowan. Mr. McGowan.
Frank, thank you very much, and it certainly is an honor and privilege to be here this evening in such capacity. Joining me as co-host trustee for this evening is Carl Wallace, sitting right here in front of me. So in case I couldn't make it to the podium, he was ready to step in. Our speaker this evening is a leading futurist and public policy analyst. Max Singer is recognized as an influential voice helping to shape the public debate on international policy issues facing the United States. Mr. Singer is a founder of the Hudson Institute, one of the country's highly respected think tanks, and served as its president from 1965 to 1973. He now heads his own consulting firm, the Potomac Organization, in Washington, D.C. Mr. Singer's principal studies have been in the areas of strategic policy, arms control, and international economic policy toward less developed countries. His articles have appeared in such publications as the New York Times Magazine, Commentary, Reader's Digest, Washington Quarterly, Washington Post, and I'm sure many others. As a respected analyst, Mr. Singer has been a leading figure in the limits to growth debate. His published works dispelling the myth that the world's population is outstripping our physical resources has put him in the center of this critical debate on the future. Mr. Singer was chosen to appear with former President Carter and to present the alternative point of view on limits to growth at the 1983 convention of the Global Tomorrow Coalition. And Ronald Reagan, in his address to the UN General Assembly in 1984, directly quoted Mr. Singer, reading several paragraphs from his article, The Myth of Scarcity. Please join me now in welcoming Mr. Max Singer.
Thank you, Mr. McGowan and Dr. Burt. Very happy to be here with the Baltimore World Affairs Council. I'm impressed with the view. I may get distracted in the course of looking at you and look. Yes. Hope I don't get distracted by the wonderful view of the sunset and the city of Baltimore as I talk tonight. It's very important, as you know, that a speaker start out either with a joke or with something that shows how educated and cultured he is. And since I don't know any jokes, I'll start with an erudite quotation from a philosophical address by Woody Allen. More than at any time in history, mankind faces a crossroads, said Mr. Allen. One path leads to despair and utter hopelessness, the other to total extinction. Let us pray that we have the wisdom to choose correctly. I'm more optimistic than Professor Allen, but tonight I will try to convince you, and I'm afraid I'll fail, that I'm not an optimist. History is made up of a few big pictures and many complexities and details. Let's begin with one of the biggest pictures of history. 2 billion years ago, the Earth was created. Our time is a little short, so I'll have to skip rapidly. 40,000 years ago, the evolution of Homo sapiens, modern man, was essentially completed. 7,000 years ago, the first civilization that we know of, the Sumerians of the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, built cities and dams and laws that look modern even today. But from that time until the time of Benjamin Franklin and our founding fathers, just about nothing happened to change the life of the ordinary person. During all that time, the average person lived less than 30 years. Almost everybody got their living from farming or herding, and almost nobody had any education to speak of. The next event in history began only 2 centuries ago, when people began to learn how to produce more efficiently. That learning process has been spreading and producing wealth for about 200 years. And if things don't get worse than they have been, it's likely that this learning process will continue and that almost all of the world will be wealthy in another century from now. But even if it takes another 2 centuries, it will still be incredibly fast. After all, it took 40 years before we got started, so it isn't a big difference whether it takes 3 centuries or 4 centuries to complete this process of spreading wealth throughout the world. The key to seeing the big picture is to make a fixed definition of wealthy. A country is wealthy if it has enough resources so that most of its people live almost a full human lifespan, over 70 years, and have at least a minimal education. By that definition, Greece today is just over the threshold to wealth. Before this century, no country in the history of the world was ever wealthy. It's really a startling statement because there has been wealth, obviously, and great things, but if you look at the lives of the people, no country has been wealthy enough to provide for its people in the way that Greece is today. The United States was the first country to become wealthy around the time of World War I. And at that time, our income per capita was about 10 times what it was in George Washington's day, but only about 1/5 of what it is today. Now, about 1/4 of the people of the world live in wealthy countries by this definition. But this is a talk about history and not about economics. The spread of wealth around the world is important not because it helps sell video cameras, but because things that wealth enable us to have, education, protection from nature, and long life, and the changes in society that are necessary to produce wealth, they change the character of human life. That's why we're interested in wealth. We're interested in the changes in human life. And I'm going to tell you today about a single, overwhelming, drastic change, which is what is happening in history today. When people have few resources, when they're poor, they are dominated by the struggle with nature. They live natural lives. When they have resources that are available in a wealthy society, people protect themselves from nature. Instead of working outdoors with their backs, most people work indoors with their minds and with their fingers. They spend most of their time on business, on politics, on science, on art and entertainment and culture, and we have to admit on crime and war. These are all human creations. They are not part of nature. People who spend most of their time on human creations live human lives. We are living human lives. Our part of the world is already human. The basic point I'm making is that when average income becomes 10 times higher than it was traditionally, the basic quality and character of people's lives are fundamentally changed. People at traditional historic levels of income led natural lives. People in wealthy countries live human lives. The world as a whole will be a human world when the great majority of people live in wealthy countries, because then most people in the world will be educated, will live long lives, and will be spending their time on human creations. So we can summarize the first major point and the fundamental point of this talk. The big picture of history is that not much happened to change the lives of ordinary people for 7,000 or even 40,000 years. Throughout history, people lived in a natural world, and then recently, very recently, what I call the passage to a human world began. That passage will take a few centuries. When the world completes the passage, probably in the lifetime of people who are now born already, maybe in the lifetime of somebody in this room, people will live forever after in a human world. In other words, and now I'm going to make it very easy for everybody to take notes and to understand history, there are only 3 periods in history. The first period covers the natural worlds of the past, 40,000 years. The second period covers the passage to a human world, the few centuries which we're in the middle of now. And the third period covers the human worlds of the future, 40,000 years. I don't go beyond that because I don't believe in long-range forecasting. But I think you'll agree that dividing everything into 3 periods makes it easy to remember history and is indeed a big picture. Well, for such a big picture, we need to ask two questions. First, is it true? And second, does it matter? You've not heard much about this big picture on your TV or in your magazines or in the books that you read, and your children have not been taught about it in school, although it's obviously not too complicated to teach. In fact, your children are more likely to have been taught the opposite, that we're making the world less human, or as in the one phrase that was used, that we are destroying our habitat. So the big picture I just represented may seem to you like an unrealistically optimistic fairy tale. Either the picture I gave is wrong, or there's something funny going on. And naturally, I believe that there's something funny going on, and we'll return to what that funny thing is a little later, but let me just say a few things about why I think it's clear that the picture I've described is true. While there's little reason to doubt that the big picture of history is true, on the other hand, it is not necessarily an optimistic view of the world. The world will soon be a human world, but it may not be a good world. Indeed, it may be worse than the natural world of the past. I don't say that it will be worse. There's no way of knowing whether life will be better or worse in the human worlds of the future. All we can know is that the world will almost certainly be richer and more human. Those are facts. Whether you think it is optimistic to notice them or pessimistic to notice them, that's up to you. I don't address that. All I say, these are the facts. We have to face the fact that the world is going to be a wealthy human world. And that's not only cause for happiness and celebration by any means. How can a wealthy human world be bad? Let me just mention one small example. Last week I was talking to a friend of mine, a doctor, about the drug problem. He said, there has to be a solution. But maybe he's not right. Maybe the drug problem may be one of the prices we have to pay for being a wealthy country. This seems like a strange idea because the drug problem hits the poor part of our society harder than it hits the rich part. But when we take a broad view, we realize that even our poor communities are much wealthy than societies have been throughout history. Families don't starve or freeze when the children don't work. And there's plenty of money around in the broader community, whether you get it by stealing or by working. And that's one of the fundamental causes of the drug problem. And the drug problem may well get worse. Better drugs may be developed. The fundamental paradox of drugs is that the better drugs are, that is, the less they cost to make you feel good, and the fewer the side effects, the worse they are. The real objection to drugs is not that they hurt you. The real objection is that it is a mistake for people to get their pleasure by taking a chemical to make themselves feel good. That's not what life is about. People who take this road later regret it themselves. It isn't what other people say. It's the experience of people who do it. Since the bad thing about the drug road is that it goes in the wrong direction, the drug problem can get worse rather than better if wealth and science let us smooth the pavement and straighten the curves and fix the guardrails. The only good long-term answer to the drug problem is for people to increase their understanding and to improve their character. If that strikes you as a little bit unlikely or not the thing that Bennett can report to the Congress, you'll begin to see why it's possible for a wealthy world to give some cause of trepidation. The four horsemen of the ancient world were famine, plague, pestilence, and war. The four horsemen of the human world are wealth, power, freedom, and knowledge. And of course, we still have war. Our experience teaches us that individuals who have had large amounts of these wonderful assets have often misused them, have caused those around them great harm, and made themselves quite unhappy. If the human world is to be protected from these four horsemen, people will have to learn new ways to develop healthy characters. because wealth shields us from some of the most powerful character developers of the past: adversity and intimate contact with the harsh realities of nature, which has always been a very good teacher and which we now are protected from. But if you're in phase with the media, you aren't worried about wealth. You've been flooded with scare stories about the three big P's: pollution, poverty, and population. And of course, the cancer scare of the month. It is inundation in the three P's that makes this big picture of history seem so surprising and perhaps unbelievable. For example, there is the idea that since the Earth is finite, there won't be enough raw materials or enough space for us to put our garbage in. Well, there's no doubt that there's much that has to be done before we're ready for a fully human world, including much that we don't yet know exactly how to do. The picture you have been given of the three P's is simply wrong. The main dangers we face in the future come from people, not from the physical conditions of the world, or from the task of providing for 10 billion wealthy people, or for cleaning up after them. The physical problems are tasks that must be dealt with, that they are not a basis for public alarm. The common perception, the common alarms, come from a huge edifice of error that blocks our vision of the real world and makes the big picture of history hard to see. Most of my book is spent on pointing out the easily available evidence and showing sort of common sense ways of thinking and reasons for rejecting the edifice of error about the physical condition of the world. Tonight, in a few minutes, I can just give you a few hints of all this evidence and argument, give you a couple of tidbits, but more will come out when you have a chance to ask questions, and I'm going to keep the talk short, so most of the time can be for questions. Can you hear me now? That better? Okay. First, on population. Despite all the scary talk, there's essential agreement among all the people who have studied the facts, Population Research Council, the United Nations, all the people, that world population will double one more time to about 10 billion people, but there's nobody who argues that it will double again in the foreseeable future. And the Earth has plenty of space and sources of food and everything else we need for 10 billion or 20 billion people. Next point is that the basic reason that we don't have to worry about running out of raw materials is that we don't use very much of them. Or it can be more precise and we say we don't use very much effort to get our raw materials. In the United States, for example, and we are, of course, the biggest per capita users of raw material, apart from our food and fuel, we spend only $170 per person to get all the raw materials we need out of the earth. $170 per person, that's virtually nothing. We have an economy of $15,000 per person, roughly. For example, the raw material for all the metals we use, and this is obviously a metal-using society, directly or indirectly, for everything, all of them together, including precious metals, costs us only $60 a year per person. If metals got scarcer, they'd cost more. But although, in fact, in the past, despite the fact that we've multiplied our use of metals, the cost has been going down. Iron and aluminum cover most of the metals that we use, and those are two of the most common substances in the crust of the earth, and there's no way in which iron and aluminum can get exceedingly expensive. The most important metal that one can imagine running out of is cobalt, which costs $10 a pound now, approximately. I'm not up to date, maybe that's a year too old, but that's the range. But we use only 1/10 of a pound a person of cobalt. In other words, the average person's cobalt bill, in effect, is $1 a year. Now, if cobalt completely disappeared, despite the great quantities in the nodules under the sea, but somehow or other there was no more cobalt and we had to do without, maybe the cost of replacing each pound of cobalt would be $1,000 a pound. I mean, nothing has ever turned out to be so hard to do without or so scarce, but imagine it went that much. The result would be that your cobalt bill would go from $1 to $100. Well, you didn't know how much you were paying for cobalt before you came into this room. If it went to $100, you wouldn't notice. It's in your income now, talking averages of $15,000. As I say, that is probably the single biggest example, and it's typical. There aren't worse problems. There's just no way in which a shortage of raw materials in the long run can hurt us. Pollution, of course, is a very complicated subject, and I devote a good deal of attention to it in the book. Tonight, I'll try to give what I consider to be the basic trend and illustrate it with a story. Some time ago, the Emperor of Japan, Hirohito, who just died, and President Bush just came back from his funeral, remarked sadly to the head of his government that he missed the butterflies that he used to see flitting around in the imperial gardens. Now, that being Japan, the head of government took that as a hint and put forward a huge and expensive program to clean up the environment, the atmosphere of Tokyo. And as a result, before he died, the emperor was again seen happily watching the butterflies flitting around in the imperial garden. The fundamental trend that this story illustrates is very straightforward. First, poverty and butterflies. Japan used to be very poor. Then, development and no butterflies. And finally, wealth and butterflies again. And that's the pattern that we've seen here, Japan, other places, and as best we can tell, that's the pattern in the world. But, and I have to remind you that I'm not an optimist, I have to say that nobody can prove that some environmental disaster won't come along that will kill everybody. That's also possible. But there's nothing in what we know that makes that likely or probable or the best guess. The basic trend that we can see from what we know and from what's happened is this simple trend that we saw with the butterflies. Now, before we get back to the interesting questions, that is, what is the significance of the passage to human world and how come nobody's noticed it, let me give you two kinds of reasons for confidence that the spread of wealth will continue, at least until most countries are wealthy. One reason is that for the last 30 years, the poor countries as a whole group have been growing richer at the rate of 2% per capita per year. That's very fast. That's the rate at which the United States or England grew. It means doubling every 36 years. It means getting 8 times richer in a century. And many countries, of course, have grown much faster, have demonstrated growth for over a generation that was never seen anywhere in the world before the last century. And these include countries that nobody thought of as wonderfully talented. These have included countries from all parts of the world with all kinds of culture and history, and they have demonstrated sustained growth and makes us think that it can happen in any kind of society. The other reason for believing that the growth will continue comes from understanding of where modern wealth comes from. It's very different from what we're used to thinking as wealth. The old ideas about wealth, that it comes from things like fertile farmland or rich mineral deposits, is outdated. Now most wealth comes from ideas, organization, mores, social intangibles, things that are in the head, not physical things. With few exceptions, the rich countries are rich because they have learned how to be more productive. Although they do not understand very well what they've learned, they know what they're doing, or they do it without understanding it. Economic development is best understood as a national learning and growing experience. That's the fundamental point about economic development. Unfortunately, it's an experience that can be quite painful. Each country has to learn for itself, but every country is motivated to learn, at least to get rich enough so that people can have full lives and a decent education. For some it is harder than others, but what reason is there to think that there's any country that can't do it if so many other countries can? As more and more countries become wealthier, it gets easier and easier for other countries to learn. There are more different examples to copy, more places to learn. The ideas get to be just in the atmosphere. And besides that, the more countries that are rich, the more money there is around the world, the easier it is to make money, just as it is in a country. So although development seems painfully slow, and many countries have long setbacks, Argentina was one of the richest countries in the world in 1930 and has been essentially stuck for 50 years, there's little reason to doubt that wealth will continue to spread until the passage to a human world is completed. But now let's turn from describing and establishing this picture to say, what difference does it make that we're now seeing the movement to a human world? Let's look at one difference between the human worlds of the future and the worlds of the past. Throughout history, most people lived in villages. This is not like a suburban village around Baltimore. These are old villages. The key thing about village life is the assumption that everybody had in villages, not anymore, that the future will be like the past. This was true for people's view of their individual future and the community future. The big questions are settled. God, king, vocation, those aren't for people to think about in villages. Typically, the village is a closed and, in fact, nearly totalitarian system that wraps its citizens in an emotional and intellectual cocoon, or we would think of it as a straitjacket. Villages don't feel existential doubt or anguish about the meaning of their lives. People knew what they were supposed to do, and they usually could do it, and the village took care of them, at least according to its own lights. That was almost everybody lived in villages always. Soon almost nobody will live in a traditional village. That's the startling change in the world. Almost everybody will have a high school education. Almost everybody will be working in money economies where change is normal. Nobody is living and doing things like his father did. And where they're subject to influence from market forces throughout the world. People will be able to and will have to choose where they live, choose what work they'll do, and decide what's important to them, things that nobody had to do before. At the point when the world first becomes a human world, that is when China and India, which will have about 30% of the world's population between them, cross the threshold to wealth, most people in the world will still be poor by American standards, even though they're wealthy by world standards. They will be the masses living in vast urban centers, mostly in Asia, and life will be grim for them. When I contrast their life to that of their ancestors, I don't think that we should think, because they're wealthy beyond the dreams of their grandparents, that life is easy for them. It's not easy, but it's different and much freer than the lives of people in the past. We're so used to freedom, that is the power to choose things for ourselves, that we find it very hard to imagine what life used to be like. In the past, practically nobody had much freedom. Most of the shackles that bound people were not placed by governments or by military tyrants, but were placed on them by the conditions of life, by the culture, and by their own assumptions of what they're supposed to think about and do. I don't know what shackles the human mind and human society will invent and impose in the future, but I do know that the shackles of the past will soon be destroyed. In the past, almost everybody was bound. In the near future, almost everybody will be free of traditional shackles. And unless people develop new shackles, the human world will be a world of people infinitely freer than the people of the history that we usually try to use to understand things today. What will happen when there are nearly 10 billion free people in the world? When 90% of people are free of the shackles that used to bind more than 90% of people? I can't say. That is too different from anything that we've ever seen. But I do know that it's different than anything has anybody seen or even thought about. And if you want to think about what's happening even today, and very soon, it is this immense number of free people that you have to think about, among other things. For example, think about the implications for religion. In the past, few people were free to choose a religion or knew what religions were available. They followed the religion of their village or their parents or ancestors. Now, modernity is often assumed to lead to secularism, as if religion depended on ignorance or on tradition or other compulsion. But I think that there are reasons to believe that secularism is only the first innocent response to modernity, and that the conditions of modern life will lead many people to feel the need for religion. People whose ancestors' lives will seem to them unrecognizable and irrelevant, people who are not raised in any religion that has confronted modernity and is suitable for modern life. But even if I'm wrong, and only a small percent of the people who become modern in the next 100 years choose to have a religion, there will still be more people choosing a religion in the next century than have done so throughout human history. I think this is something that the people in religion have not yet faced up to or thought about, although it is probably the decisive issue in the future of religion. Now we have to turn to the something funny that's going on. Why no one talks about our being in the middle of the greatest change in life since man evolved. Why no one has noticed the mountain of history that's outside our window. You have to turn, when we do this, we have to turn from facts, which I can report to you with great confidence, to speculation, which is only speculation. But let me summarize my speculation for this great disparity between the way people perceive things and the way they are. I believe that there is a special category of about 10% of Americans who I call university-oriented Americans, UOAs. Probably includes two-thirds of the people in this audience. That includes me. That category includes all the people who are responsible for ideas in this country. They're responsible for teaching, for putting on television shows and radio shows, running seminar programs, and so forth. Those people are all, that's the job of UOAs. But they're only 10% of the population. I believe that UOAs don't have the same ideas and feelings about the world as the rest of the other 90% of Americans. In particular, I believe that in the last generation, UOAs have come to have low morale about the United States. Not personal morale, but their feelings about the United States. Morale concerns organizations, your feeling about organizations that you're part of. And low morale is essentially a lack of self-respect for an organization that you're part of. As a result of this low national morale by UOAs, bad news seems reasonable and important to them. Good news doesn't fit in. Their low national morale makes them unable to understand the world in a way that reflects favorably on the United States. And this picture of what's happening in history reflects very favorably on the United States, although, of course, we're not the only ones responsible for it. Gradually, UOAs have built up a picture of reality that fits their feelings of guilt and their lack of self-respect for the country. Facts, and now you notice I'm not saying that all UOAs have this guilt and lack of self-respect, but the great majority, so that it is the wave, the psychological momentum in that group. Facts and ideas that contradict this picture may be reported, but they don't hang together. They slide off the bigger picture in their heads, which is derived from their low national morale. So the result, if I'm correct, with this hypothesis, this speculation, is that this big picture that I present, the facts that I present, which really should be ho-hum, quite obvious, everybody should know them, but they're often received as, oh my gosh, you must be wrong. How can that be? But rather than assuming that I can't be right, let me leave you instead with the suggestion that the same low national morale that is preventing us from seeing and teaching our children what is happening in history is also affecting other aspects of our national discussion. Low morale is a corrosive emotion in any organization, and practically everybody has seen low morale in some organization. We need to recognize and beware of the consequences of low national morale among UOAs in our own country because they are so central to our national discussion. And so we have to learn to understand and to respond to and protect ourselves against low morale. That's, I guess, one of the first impacts of our part of the world becoming a human world, and it's our task for the future if we're to safely shepherd our country and our world through the challenges that face us, the challenges of making a human world a good world. Thank you.
Mr. Singer, do you think that the decline of village life will see a diminution of ancestor worship and a decline in ethnicity and sort of tribal behavior and therefore less danger of war?
The question was whether the ending of village life will mean a reduction in ancestor worship, ethnicity, and ethnic conflict. Well, ancestor worship, yes, I think that definitely will decline. Although you can say that the movement in this country to be concerned about our roots, while not ancestor worship, is perhaps a related human psychological phenomenon, and it seems to me one that's not unhealthy. Ethnic issues are much broader than villages. I mean, fundamentally, it's usually a language thing, and I think they've demonstrated great staying power. But except perhaps in the Middle East, they haven't been the greatest source of conflict recently. And I think that the world will be able to live with or control the conflict created by continuing ethnic feeling and national feeling. But it's going to be a concern. People are different in lots of ways, including their national, language, cultural feelings, attachment, values, and attitudes. And those differences make for conflicts. And I think we will not see soon an end of those differences and temptations to conflict. I think we can be reasonably hopeful that it won't mean a lot of fighting and killing, but some.
Yes, in the rear, Mrs. Johnson.
I was wondering if your ideas about low morale come from wealth. Because as you say, the wealthier you are, the more you have time to think, the more you have time to think, the more you have time to worry. And that as people become wealthier, they're just going to be more worried. And is that just an inherent dilemma?
Yeah, the question is whether low morale is an inevitable result of wealth. Part of the question was perhaps that you need wealth to have low morale. I'm not sure about that. That might be true. But that the real guts of it was, is it inevitable and therefore an inevitable result of wealth? And first answer is I don't know. Second answer is but I don't think so.
I think that if nobody heard the question, it was the reason that there would be low morale. It was not just being wealthy, it's the wealth gives you time to think, and the thinking
Thinking is depressing.
fills you with dilemmas. And the dilemmas about what you should do or how you should live often lead to, I think, a low morale. I don't think you would find that. The kind of literature that you have in the 20th century, which is filled with anime, you don't have in the 17th century, the 16th, the Middle Ages. And so it may be just the time that you have to think, to write, and to discuss gives you that. That's, in other words,
Yes, okay.
I wanted to make it a little
Yes,
different than
all
just
right,
wealth.
that's fair enough. I still don't think it's inevitable. I think it's possible to have time to think and not to become low morale about the country. People don't become low morale about themselves and necessarily about other organizations. It's low national morale and to some extent species morale that comes from or with the time to think. I just don't believe it's inevitable. Although it certainly has happened, and maybe it's part of a transition. Maybe for the first generations that people have so much time to think, they develop this kind of thought. But I can't believe that after we have 10 billion people with time to think over generations or centuries, they're still all going to be thinking nothing but low morale thoughts.
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Singh, it sounds simplistic, but would you define your human world?
Yes, a human world is a world in which almost everybody, 3/4, 80% of people, have enough resources so they live what we would think of as human lives. That is, conditions good enough to live more than 70 years, at least a minimal education, and all the things that flow through that, including that you spend your time on human creations, not on the struggle against nature.
Does that negate religion?
No. Human is not in contradiction to God. God created people and nature equally. We do not know whether he intended for us to create a human world. There's certainly room for argument that it is, and I don't use human in any sense as opposite to God.
Yes, sir. Towards the end of your talk, you expressed the feeling that, in essence, that our university-oriented Americans, as you call them, were perceiving the world incorrectly because we were looking through
The opposite of rose-colored glasses.
Yes, that was exactly what came to mind. Well, my question is, what's your prescription for a balanced viewpoint? I mean, on the other extreme, one can look at the Argentines and the Falklands to see where a robust optimism wasn't good for business. So.
Well, everything has its price, and there are high morale mistakes as well as low morale mistakes. I don't think that high morale means the shallow optimism or go out and get them no matter what. High morale is compatible with realistic assessment of situation and a sense of control and respect for others. Low morale is, I think, an unhealthy situation. It certainly is in individuals, and it is as we see it in organizations. It makes you try crackpot solutions instead of real ways out of the trouble, and it makes you fail to understand your situation. So, but you're right, high morale also produces problems. I think less problems, and all you can do is work to study the actual facts about particular situations and make sound judgments.
Mrs. Hassett?
You defined wealth in terms of human resources, and it reminded me of a theory that I think it was Cloward and Plymouth had, that the welfare class is necessary for us so when we go to war we've got cannon fodder. Would you say that a country that's wealthy in natural resources can throw away some of its wealth to drugs, to poor education, to whatever is killing off, or making a lot of our populations unproductive?
Well, first of all, the question was whether or not wealth leads to throwing away resources such as...
are defined as human resources, which is your definition of wealth.
Yes. I think of resources being human resources, not natural resources. That is, human beings are the primary source of our wealth. They are the wealth, and one of the main evidences of our success is that our time is expensive. That is, it's valuable when we sell it, and unfortunately, when we buy other people's time, it's expensive, which is what we complain about, prices going up. And people's time is the greatest cost in our society. Certainly, when you have wealth, you can waste it. You can waste it in any way that people can think of, including new ways. I don't think you have to waste it. And so I don't believe that the fact that we have wealth means that we're going to get into wars. Say the fundamental thing that happens with wealth is that people become more valuable. Now, some people make mistakes and decide to use people wrong ways. Wealth doesn't produce wisdom. And when you have wealth, you have power, and that means a greater need for wisdom. But I don't think it means an inevitable waste. Does that respond to?
No.
Okay, try again.
I mean, I quoted Pliven and Cloward because they said that the welfare people are the ones we're going to send to war, so we need to have them so when we go to war. But you raise a question of drug addiction. If you look at our school systems, how many kids are not graduating from high school? How many kids are not learning anything? Seems to me we're throwing away wealth, and I'm wondering if that's
Yes.
part of your theory.
It's not part of my theory. I agree with you with throwing away wealth. I disagree with Cloward and Piven that welfare people make good soldiers, or that we design our welfare system in order to be able to fight wars. We don't even design our Pentagon to fight wars, let alone our welfare system. So does that now respond?
Yes, sir.
I'm interested that if I heard you correctly, we've come 40,000 years, we got a few centuries of passage, and then we'll have another 40,000 years. Whether there's any significance in choosing another 40,000 years, and once we reach that, you say more people feel the psychological need for a religion. What does your hypothesis give you as the character of religions that would fit that era?
That's a good question.
Well, I just picked 40,000 as for the world of the future for balance with the 40,000 of the past. It may, and sometimes I use a simple graph, horizontal line representing the past, nearly vertical line representing the period we're in now, and another horizontal line, and I say that I can predict that that other line will be more or less horizontal for 40,000 years because of what I choose it to measure, namely the length of life, and we're changing life from short to essentially full human lifespan, so it can't grow anymore. We're changing things in percentage terms. We're changing the percent of people who are wealthy from low to nearly 100%. So once it's 100%, it can't change in 40,000 years or 80,000 years. Same thing with the percent of the people who are educated or the percent of time spent on human creations. It used to be almost nothing. In a human world like we live in, it's almost 100% of our time is spent on human creations. Once you read 100%, there's nothing that can make it more than 100%. So that's why I can talk about 40,000 years with some confidence, because I'm talking about some of these fundamental things which reach their limit. Now, I don't doubt that a great deal will happen and that nobody can imagine what life will be like 1,000 years ago from now, let alone 40,000, although it will be rich and human. And some of these basic things, we're in this one-time change. Now, in terms of what the religion will be like, I guess I don't, I have my own religion. I think that I'm Jewish, and I think that Jewish religion is close to the Christian religion, and I think that both of us together are in the same situation, that this is our chance to help people to achieve a sense of God and of the kind of strength and strengthening of character that can come from religion, that people will be searching for that, and they will find it in our way in the next century, or we will have lost a unique opportunity. But this is a personal, separate view. It is by no means the message of my book, which doesn't mention religion, and certainly not which religion. That I can't tell. What I do feel is that people will feel a need for something beyond getting and spending, something that gives them a sense of meaning and purpose, a sense of guidance and authority that many people today find in religion, and I think will be even more needed in a modern human world.
Yes, ma'am.
Why do you say that the world population will double once but not again?
Yeah, I said it'll double once, but that nobody says it's going to double again in the foreseeable future. And the reason is the experience that we've had, that when countries get rich, children get expensive. You have to educate them. You live in more expensive things and they take up space. And so as a result, in every country, as the country has gotten richer, people chose to have fewer children. And so the calculations that are made by all the people who use the existing data are that growth rate is going to zero within 100 years. Now, I personally don't believe that that tells you much about the long-term future. Maybe when they get richer, people decide they want children, growth rate will go up, down, I don't know. All we can say is the current burst of population growth will end with one more doubling in much less than 2. What will happen in the long term, nobody knows.
What do you think will happen in this new world to the study of the past? We see pressures these days towards the neglect, patronization of the classics, the erudite reading of the past and religion and history and philosophy. If I have an anxiety in an otherwise nice picture that you're presenting, it's that we will continue to depreciate the past in favor of an unknown future and lose something in the process. I wonder if you could respond to that, sir.
I absolutely agree with that. The question was, in the future, when we're going to be in a world that's so different from all the past, will we stop studying the past? And questioner expressed his feeling that that would be a great loss if it happened, and that it's starting to happen, that we see too much of it already. And I agree with that. When you go into a new world, the moorings are lost. One of the moorings, one of the important things that have helped people is to know and understand and look to their past. As the past gets more distant in the sense that it's irrelevant, that the people in the past were living lives incomprehensible to us, that past, first of all, we may pay less attention to it, but even if we look at it, it'll be hard to relate to it. Although I think that there still will be much to learn for the past because people haven't changed that much. Their settings, all the influence on them changed, but human nature and certainly many of the political qualities and facts are very relevant. But I agree with you. One of the dangers, one of the hardships, one of the difficulties of living in a human world is that at the beginning we won't have much experience in it, and the experience that we have, which was in a natural world, will be not so relevant in many ways and not so meaningful to us because we'll feel different from it, and that's a problem.
You talked about the human world and the natural world, and there are a great number of people who are still living in the natural world, and they're faced with all the problems. How do you explain how they will come into the human world when they have all these natural things against them?
The question was, I talk about a human world and a natural world, but right now we're in the middle, and still there are many people living in not exactly the natural world of the past, but in many ways more like it than like the human world of the future. And how are they going to get out of the natural world into the human world? And the answer is basically the same way we did, but easier for them, because we were the path breakers and they are going along a well-trodden path. That if you think of becoming wealthy as essentially a learning experience, a national learning and growing experience, a change like growing up, that has to go step by step, and each society has to do it its own way separately because they start in a different way, they have a different personality, if you will. But that the more examples there are, and the more money there is around, the easier it is to become wealthy. So I think that each of the societies will go through this learning experience until it becomes wealthy, becomes more productive. Productive doesn't depend on what raw materials you have, it depends on the people and the way the society is organized. And there's no, the wonderful thing about modern wealth is that it isn't limited. My wealth doesn't subtract from your wealth. There's no set amount. And in fact, the more Japan gets wealthy, it helps the United States. The more Europe gets wealthy, it helps Japan. We all can go up together, and certainly the poor countries are not prevented from becoming more productive by the fact that there are rich countries the other way around. So that the rate at which you become wealthy is limited because it's just so fast you can change. Just like the person can't mature. No matter how many books you give a kid, he doesn't become a 40-year-old overnight. So wealth is rate limited, but it's not quantity limited. One thing, people are able to work longer. I think the issue of how wealthy we get depends not so much about the age distribution of the population, but on our desires to emphasize wealth versus leisure versus protection of the environment versus other interests which may conflict with further increases in wealth. While I haven't done a real calculation of the productivity of the age distribution of which we'll end up in when we've eliminated early death.
People are not working longer. They're retiring early. So.
Okay. Then if people choose to work less, there'll be less wealth. Very straightforward.
Our last question.
Yes. What were your predictions in the mid-'60s for the late '80s?
The question is, how did I do when I predicted 20 years ago? I've been saying this kind of thing about resources for well over 10 years. Some of my colleagues and I called in 1980 in print the decline in oil prices, although that really is not a phenomenon on the scale that we're talking now. It's a much more narrow issue. Essentially, the tanks were getting full, so you couldn't keep putting oil into storage, and so the demand had to drop. But we predicted that correctly. I'd say some of my predictions have come true, and some of them haven't. I've made some mistakes. I certainly didn't predict the Ayatollah. That was one of my failures. I try only to predict things which have already happened.
In thanking you for this evening, I won't try to guess at what everyone has taken away concerning the future. But I will comment that for those of you who are familiar with the work of Herman Kahn, who was a great colleague of yours, an evening with Mr. Kahn and a teacher. An evening with Mr. Kahn was always an enormous pleasure, and I think I can safely say that an evening with Max Singer has been a great delight indeed and edifying. Thank you very much.
Invited to come.